In April 1994, the shooting down of Rwandan President Habyarimana's plane marked the start of the most concentrated killing in human history. Between April and June 1994, Hutu militias killed approximately 800,000 men, women, and children who either belonged to the Tutsi ethnic group or sympathized with the Tutsi people. Perhaps the most shocking element of this genocidal killing within Rwanda was the element of mass participation, as ordinary citizens came to be mobilized into the killing of acquaintances, neighbors, and friends. Radio became a device utilized by the Hutu officials to harness ethnic tensions, and the publication of anti-Tutsi propaganda facilitated this. Furthermore, the radio gave details of targets and their locations. Thus, radio became directly involved in the killings as a device which allowed Hutu officials to inspire and organize the killing groups. This project will focus on the Rwandan Radio Television Libre de Mille Collines, otherwise known as RTLM, broadcast from the 12th of April 1994. This RTLM broadcast is representative of the common themes and techniques found in the majority of RTLM broadcast transcripts. To contemplate the influence radio had amongst Hutu perpetrators, my second primary source will be the oral history interviews conducted by Jean Hatzfeld. These interviews with the perpetrators of the genocide offer an insight into the ways which radio moulded Hutu perceptions of ethnicity, politics, and nationality. Furthermore, we can extrapolate the influence radio had on their murderous actions. For a sense of contrast, I will analyse a clip from the BBC, which allows me to contemplate the role international radio reporting played on the events within Rwanda. Alongside these primary sources, secondary research of historians and sociologists will help contextualise the damaging role the radio's hate speech and musical interludes played within Rwanda. The radio's ability to harness ethnic divisions has been at the centre of historiography discussing media influence in Rwanda. However, the ability of the radio to organise Hutu militias and to mobilise ordinary Hutu citizens is equally as important. Furthermore, historiography has typically portrayed Rwanda as an isolated African nation. Yet, in analysing the RTLM transcript alongside the oral history accounts of Hutu perpetrators, it can be seen that Rwandan citizens had a degree of global awareness throughout the genocide and recognised that outside forces, such as the UN and Western governments, were not intervening or condemning their actions. Thus, I shall be contemplating the media's influence on the Rwandan genocide from a global history perspective, rather than taking the approach of a micro-historian. Ultimately, this project will explore the techniques used by both Rwandan radio broadcasters and international radio stations in 1994. The radio's creation of a Tutsi enemy image helps us comprehend how non-combatant Hutu citizens were mobilised to kill in such an efficient, brutal way. Furthermore, we will consider broader questions about the responsibilities of the international community in tackling the existence of hate media and the wider implications of the persuasive influence of radio. My first source for this study is RTLM broadcast dated the 12th of April 1994. Distributed to persuade Hutu citizens to participate in the genocide, this source gives an understanding of how radio constructed the Tutsi population as an enemy. The proliferation of hate speech, racially charged music, and consistent attempts to describe their own honesty and importance mean that I shall be considering the source as an example of propaganda. Presented primarily by Kantano Habimana, who was charged with genocidal killing and conspiracy to commit genocide, this transcript can be seen as a representative example of the types of radio propaganda dominating Rwanda between April and June 1994. Initially, one is drawn to the frequent threats, name-calling, and scapegoating of Tutsi individuals throughout the transcript. The strength of the language used, including the Kinyarwanda word for cockroach, which is inyenzi, demonstrates the extremity of RTLM rhetoric. This inflammatory language is used alongside calls to action, such as "people are determined to fight" and "whoever fights them should not give up." This rallying call to Hutus is a primary strategy deployed by radio to influence the occurrence of genocidal killing. Of course, as we are considering this source to be an example of propaganda, this is unsurprising, as Habimana's broadcast is striving to mobilise Hutu civilians through anger and also through fear, and this style of language is an effective way of achieving this goal. Furthermore, the radio utilised music to construct a hatred of the Tutsi people. The musical interlude by Simon Bikindi is one example of this, as his song Nanga Abahutu sees Bikindi chastise Hutu people who are not willing to kill their Tutsi neighbours. The persuasive nature of Bikindi's song is exemplified in the fact that he was charged with direct and public incitement to commit genocide in 2008. The song's lyrics see Bikindi recount a historical narrative condemning Hutus who do not remember their Hutu heroes of the past. He tells how Hutu heroes were historically killed at the hands of Tutsi rulers and colonial administrators. This historical narrative valorises the Hutu and demonises the Tutsi monarchy. By listening to the song, as it was meant to be heard, the use of historical and cultural tropes can be identified, with traditional instruments and sounds being used alongside radical lyrics. The use of traditional Rwandan cultural material, alongside the radical words of the radio station's presenters, gave the RTLM message an infusion of legitimacy. This was complemented by the use of westernised culture. Later in the broadcast, the presenter plays Now That We Found Love by Heavy D and the Boys. Rwanda in 1994 was a society with a high level of global awareness, and elites recognised the perceived cultural, political, and ideological dominance of American society. Therefore, by infusing RTLM broadcasts with American songs, broadcasters sought to give a tacit sense of Western legitimacy, as well as demonstrating a level of international acceptance of the radio's calls for genocide. The quest for legitimacy is further drawn out in the consistent use of words such as truth and your radio station, as RTLM broadcasters sought to secure themselves a position of trust within the Rwandan population's lives. Linguistically, one can identify a theme of inclusion and exclusion throughout the transcript, as words such as us, we, and Rwandans are employed to create a sense of unity amongst the Hutus, as well as a sense of universality to their cause. These words are juxtaposed against the exclusionary language such as they and foreigners. This shows how colonially developed ethnic distinctions had developed into deep social divisions. The statement that throughout the country people are determined to fight saw presenters offer a sense of reassurance for the inclusive Hutu perpetrators that they were not alone and that the murderous acts they were committing were contextually acceptable and widespread. Ultimately, this source provides a critical foundation for understanding the influence of radio on the events in Rwanda, as it demonstrates the demonisation of the Tutsis, the valorisation of the Hutu, and the utilisation of music to consolidate these perspectives. Its language and deployment of diverse musical interludes demonstrate the inflammatory rhetoric dominant in 1994 Rwandan radio, as well as highlighting the ways Rwandan radio sought to normalise this call to violent action for their listeners. The second source for this study is a series of oral history interviews by Jean Hatzfeld with the perpetrators of the genocide. Transmitted by Hatzfeld, the interviews come from a reliable source and can offer an insight into the genocide from a perspective which is rarely offered in genocide historiography, the perspective of the killer. The perpetrators underline the influence of radio on their experiences of the genocide. In contrast to the radio clip, this source gives us an insight into the infiltration of radio into normal life. Whilst the radio's weapon was words, this translated into the population equipping themselves with machetes and participating in killing en masse. Through analysis of these interviews, I hope to gain an insight into the process by which words translated into genocidal killing. Pancrace's assertion that when you have been prepared the right way by the radio and their official advice, you obey more easily, even if the order is to kill your neighbour, we see that the perpetrators themselves perceived a level of conditioning coming from the radio. The use of the word official to describe the advice of the radios demonstrates the way that Hutu citizens perceive the radio broadcasters to be an authoritative voice, even though presenters such as Habimana did not work in an official capacity within the Hutu government or militias, and the radio claimed to be independent and free of government influence. Payo's interview reinforces this perspective as he describes the firm orders from the authorities on RTLM. The calls to action by propagandists came to be regarded as persuasive, direct orders which Hutu non-combatants had no alternative but to follow. In Pancrace's interview, we see that the perpetrators mirrored the language used in RTLM broadcasts. The repeated uses of the words Inyenzi, meaning cockroach, and Inkotanyi, meaning warrior, reflected the influence of the radio on the language used amongst the killers. We also see that the colonial-imposed ethnic distinctions between Tutsi and Hutu, which were for all intents and purposes a social construct, had come to possess a very real meaning in Rwandan society, not only marking differences between individuals, but with these distinctions coming to dictate whether or not a person would be considered human and worthy of life. Secondary research sees historians such as Melbourne blame colonialism for ethnic distinctions, and therefore for the genocide. However, whilst ethnic policies do have their roots in colonialism, Rwandans did not have to accept this, and this ethnically charged atmosphere did not have to be the framework of independence. Thus, these interviews demonstrate that whilst colonial discourses of ethnicity played a role in causing the genocide, so too did the Rwandan officials, musicians, and everyday citizens who constructed a culture of us versus them using the radio, thereby embodying and perpetuating colonial discourses. The infiltration of the radio in day-to-day life is a recurring theme of this source. Eli's interview sees him describe the influence of music, such as Bikindi's song, which was seen within the RTLM transcript. Eli's description of himself having lots of fun reflects the fact that the radio's attempts to become a populist radio station had in fact succeeded. Therefore, in the day-to-day lives of Hutus, the radio was casting subliminal ethnicized messages alongside explicitly hateful speeches. This ensured that a wider audience were influenced by their broadcasts. We see that one of the primary concerns amongst the perpetrators was the idea of inclusion. Throughout the interviews, the perpetrators repeatedly assert that they need to know the killings were continuing nationwide. RTLM served to reassure this concern among Hutu militias, confirming that the killing was normal, continued, and justified. As such, radio performed a function of facilitating what Kello described as bandwagon killing, with individuals killing largely with the intention of fitting in. Ultimately, the use of oral history sources gives an insight into the minds of the perpetrators. This source offers a unique first-hand account of the genocide, with in-depth descriptions of the ways radio impacted the day-to-day affairs of conflict-ridden Rwanda. The accounts repeatedly reflect on the theme of music as an influencer, which united people and constructed a sense of joy during a time which history will remember as being bleak and incomprehensible. This underlines the largest virtue of this source. Oral history sources allow us to learn about the perspectives of individuals who may not otherwise appear on the historical record. Therefore, we gain a unique perspective into the evidently crucial influence of radio on contemporary Rwandan life. My final source is a clip from BBC radio programme Talk About Africa, dated the 13th of July 1994. This source is in contrast to the RTLM transcript, and was recorded as the killings in Rwanda were coming to a close. By contemplating Western radio's approach to reporting the genocide, we can extrapolate how Western failings and successes played into the events within Rwanda. The significance of Western media is underlined when considering the global awareness of Rwandans, as the highly publicised Arusha Accords had seen Rwanda tied into trade deals and aid programmes on an international scale. As such, the lack of global media attention fed the perception of the killers that nobody would judge them. One of the most notable points to make in contemplating Western media portrayals of the genocide is how few sources there are to choose from. References to the Rwandan genocide cannot be found in contemporary headline news of any European country. For example, British headlines during the month of April, which saw the most rapid killing, focused on the stroke of President Nixon, the death of Kurt Cobain, and the occurrence of multi-party elections in South Africa. The fact that reporting on the genocide was so limited outside of specialist African radio programmes demonstrates that perhaps the most significant barrier facing Western radio global reporting was the limit on attention. Gulseth suggests that Western stereotypes of tribal conflict and ethnic violence on the continent of Africa have led to a problem of minimisation and trivialisation of the African content within Western media. Whilst this is certainly an assertion which can be queried, this does open up an interesting debate about whether the media has a responsibility to report international news equally, regardless of the preferences of national audiences. The portrayal of the genocide as a bloody war and as mayhem within this source demonstrates how international media fed stereotypes and reinforced Western prejudices. Descriptions of a frenzied population armed with machetes may have held some level of truth, but also undermined the level of organisation by Hutu elites. Furthermore, Western media diminished the violence to tribal warfare, a categorisation with deep colonial links, as references to tribes are deemed to be historically inaccurate. The refusal of Western media to label the mass murder in Rwanda as a genocide can be linked to Hatzfeldt's oral history interviews. Many of the perpetrators suggested that they had not heard the term genocide and did not consider their act to be of this nature. Thus, the perspectives of perpetrators cannot be considered to have been forged purely on a local scale, and the denial of genocidal intent was formulated across individual, local, and global platforms. The BBC report selected, entitled "The War in Rwanda," embodies many of the common mistakes witnessed within Western radio broadcasting. The death toll cited as reaching into the hundreds of thousands vastly underestimates the death toll at the time of publication, which had reached approximately 800,000. Furthermore, in earlier BBC reports dated back to April 18th, the most violent day of the genocide, the BBC reporter explained that violence in Rwanda was waning. This minimisation of the scale of the genocide influenced the climate amongst Western audiences for Western intervention. With hindsight, it could be considered that Western intervention may have changed the course of events in Rwanda, and, as suggested by Tyrrell, the death toll could potentially have been significantly lower if information surrounding the internal affairs of Rwanda had been more widespread. The common misconceptions of Western media can partially be understood as being a result of the exodus of Western reporters from Kigali following the assassination of President Habyarimana. Without men on the ground, the painting of an accurate picture became ever more difficult, and the style of live broadcasts, which often formulated headline news, became considerably more challenging to achieve. However, the lack of voices on the ground did present the opportunity for one virtue of Western reporting. The BBC frequently interviewed Tutsi people and white settlers living within the region to hear stories from the ground, instilling a sense of African agency within their reporting. However, even within this, the scope of reporting was limited, with the central focus of all reports remaining in Kigali. However, Kigali was only home to 4% of Rwanda's population in 1994, and violence stretched the nation, crossing borders into Burundi and Uganda. Ultimately, an analysis of the BBC report entitled "War in Rwanda" demonstrates the weakness of Western media in standing against colonial-imposed ethnic stereotypes. The failings of the BBC to label the genocide correctly helped formulate the sense of innocence amongst perpetrators, as well as the apparent feeling that they were acting unjudged and unchallenged. Whilst hindsight tells us as historians that Western intervention could have drastically altered the course of events within Africa, a reflection on contemporary Western media helps shed light on the common misconceptions and minimisations which may have prevented such interventions, all the while perpetuating the violence amongst globally aware Rwandan citizens. Radio was a crucial device for mobilising, organising and directing Hutu militants to carry out genocidal activities. A number of recurrent themes are apparent throughout my analysis, including the linguistic and musical attempts to disseminate violence. The use of radical, divisive language offers insight into the ethnic tensions at the times, and the measures officials were willing to take to eliminate those they perceived as posing a threat. The translation of propaganda transmitted by the radio into active genocidal killing poses interesting questions for historians. Historians can come to ask about the malleability of the human psyche, as well as looking at the persuasion attainable from a source of information if that source is given space to dominate. More could have been discussed in terms of the organisational capabilities of Rwandan radio, as well as the responsibilities of the broader Western world, whether they should have jammed Rwandan radios, and whether they had a responsibility to label and condemn the genocide. However, these three sources offered an interesting insight into the role of radio on different scales, penetrating the individual, local, and global scale to reach the conclusion that radio was a powerful source in Rwanda in 1994. The influence of radio within Rwanda is a poignant reminder of the importance of considering cultural aspects when constructing an understanding of dramatic historical events. Ultimately, the way radio was manipulated in Rwanda has long-term implications both within the discipline of history but also further afield, denoting a level of responsibility to stand against hate speech which incites violence. it is crucial to identify that genocide stems from a multitude of sources, and whilst the causal links to one of these sources cannot be overstated, the persuasive nature of radio in Rwanda was a prominent factor in the widespread organised killing of 800,000 men, women, and children in 1994.